Hello, thank you everyone for joining us today. Welcome to the Mortgage Industry Pandemic Summit. My name is Mike Annam and I will be your MC for this session. This session is Distance in the Field, Maintaining Properties in the Age of New Safety Guidelines. First and foremost, I hope everyone is doing well and staying safe. Before we begin, there are just a few housekeeping items I want to cover. This is an interactive session that will include Q&A at the end. To ask a question during the presentation, please use the question box on the right and type in your question. Please do not use the chat box. We will not be monitoring the chat box. The speakers will then answer your questions at the end of this session. We will now begin our session. This session is moderated by Lindsay Pryor, Senior Manager of Business Development for Altisource. With that said, Lindsay, toss it over to you.
Great, thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for spending your Thursday afternoon with us. As Michael said, my name is Lindsay Pryor, and I lead product for Altisource Field Services. Today, we have an amazing panel, Distance in the Field, Maintaining Properties in the Age of New Safety Guidelines. So we'll be talking about COVID-19 and the impacts it's had on data utilization, accepting new technology, and best practices from the field. Joining us today for our panelists, there's Quentin Finley, Chief Revenue Officer of Earthvisionz, Eric Miller, Executive Director of NAMFS, and RJ Cavalier, and he leads VMO for Altisource Field Services. So I'll kick off the conversation with the question to each panelist, and as Michael said, we will periodically poll the audience. At the end of this session, we'll have time for Q&A. And our goal today is that no matter your role within the industry, that you come away with something new, a new idea, fresh perspective, or a new strategy that you can apply to be more successful in your business. So my first question is for Quentin. Quentin, so let's talk about COVID-19 and how do we keep our clients and vendor networks informed about COVID-19, its infection rates in communities, and the properties that we serve.
Thanks, Lindsay. So I think the most important way to do this is to be able to pull in data from a large number of sources, especially getting as geo-localized as possible, meaning that we have an understanding of where all of the properties are already, but not always an understanding of what's happening around those properties beyond weather. Situations like a pandemic create a new opportunity for building situational awareness in different vectors. One of the things that we've been doing, for example, is working with Johns Hopkins and other data sources to pull in daily updates on what's happening on a national and a global scale, and working with state and local government authorities to pull in information on what's happening regionally and locally as well. The end state is to try and hyper localize our understanding of the impact before we send somebody into the environment so that they can understand the risks that they're facing and be prepared to protect themselves when they're in that environment. So thanks for the question. And then moving into my slides, what do we know about COVID-19? We've been tracking this since fairly early on, before it became a large issue in the US. We were starting to track the global implications. And the truth is that they're still increasing. And you can see that they are starting to flatten out. But there are very few countries, and this map is only 7 days old. There are very few countries that are starting to approach a flat line. They're leveling off, but they're not flat yet. There's still growth. So we're continuing to monitor that, and we will continue to monitor that, as will the whole global community, as long as that's true, however long that ends up being. Next slide, please. One back. Thanks. So if we think about things in terms of what, decision matrix or a Johari window, what do we actually know and understand? At this point, we understand the basics of how COVID-19 is transmitted. We understand that it's a respiratory transmission path. We understand that there are ways to protect against that, but really it travels with the breath. And so as long as we're breathing and we're around other people who are breathing, the closer we are, the more exposed we are, and we understand that that's how it's transmitted. We're still learning and refining, the symptomology and our understanding of the symptomology, like what indicates an opportunity. We don't have widespread testing. So I live in the state of Colorado. We've been instructed that if we think we might have some symptoms that are reflective of COVID-19, that we treat it as if until we can't work with our own situation, and then to go to a hospital, trying to prevent an overload on the healthcare systems. And I happen to be a Marine Corps veteran, following the impact on active duty military forces as well. The Teddy Roosevelt is a great example, and they've had, north of 800 cases. 80 to 85% of their cases are asymptomatic. So it's really challenging to follow, despite we know how it's transmitted. It's challenging to follow who's got it, who might be a carrier for it, and even presence of antibodies in people's systems, because their symptomology doesn't match the indicators that would trigger testing, et cetera, in most cases. So what don't we know? The true picture of everywhere it's been and everywhere it's yet to spread, because we don't have widely available testing strategies yet that have been validated. So, my time in the Marine Corps, when we would go into an environment like that, we had to assume that it was a persistent risk of exposure and treat everywhere as if. I expect that that'll probably change as we get better with testing strategies and we're able to do things that support reopening the economy in a different way. For example, not far from me in Weld County, Colorado, there's a JBS plant where the state has deployed a persistent testing station to support the people that work at the JBS plant, which has been declared an essential system. So making sure that these testing abilities are present when there are places where people are needing to gather because they're providing an essential service. I think that that's going to help us understand a little bit more about the risk picture as well. But for right now, we're left assuming that it's a persistent risk and that we're perpetually at risk of exposure. Next slide, please. We do understand that social distancing works. Although, the way that it's often portrayed is a little bit of spin. So really the necessity of social distancing is not to shrink the window of impact and not to necessarily even avoid the possibility of exposure. Rather, it's to help shrink the top of the curve to a level where our healthcare system isn't overwhelmed. So it may, in fact, elongate the period of time that we face exposure. But if we do it more rapidly and we have a huge number of cases, we overwhelm our ability to care for those who come down with it. And so we're really trying to stretch our ability to care for those who are diagnosed with COVID-19 and take care of them without collapsing our healthcare system. So that's really what's happening with social distancing. It's not to shrink the incidence of COVID-19, the periodicity of it. It's really to make sure that the curve is as close to what our healthcare system can manage as possible. Next slide, please. And then, social distancing is great, but we still have to move into areas that are high risk areas, move in them, do something, move out of them. And the real challenge is, where are those at any given time? And so when I think about things in terms of building a deeper understanding of where the exposure is, it has to be hyper localized. We can't just rely on national level reports. We need to be able to go down to the neighborhood or the house property level, not just the region. And so being able to tap into a deeper level of understanding that's geolocated and confirmable is important. Next slide, please.
Hey, Quentin, I want to stop you right there. So for a question, and this the panelists can answer. So good news is, for the most part, our business has been deemed an essential service. So are there any good websites you would recommend for our vendors and inspectors, contractors out in the field to visit to get an understanding of how they can protect themselves?
And I would be happy to follow up with some of those as well. You can find me on LinkedIn easily enough. I'll respond to people individually if they'd like. And I'll make sure that you have them as well, Lindsay, for anybody who comes in. But there are definitely resources. I know on the summit website itself, there's a list of resources for being able to track what's happening. That includes the map that's put out by Johns Hopkins, which is pretty, it's excellent, and an authoritative source too. So I think part of the challenge is, though, as you look at these things, and this is a good time to launch the poll too. Part of the challenge is, as you look at these things, is understanding how to parse through. You know, I was an intelligence officer in the Marine Corps, and to use a military analogy, we call it looking through the noise to find the signal. So looking through all of the data to find what's true. And that can be really daunting. And so really trying to discern who are the authoritative data sources and the ones that we can trust. And that's not just at a larger level, it's all the way down to the local levels. And there are resources for that. One of the things that I wanted to just read a blurb from, OSHA now has a fact sheet out for protecting workers during a pandemic. And I think it's worth calling out, you know, the safety aspects of things and leveraging technology to make sure employees are safe. The quote says, "Workers who believe that their employer provides a safe and healthy workplace are more likely to report for work during a pandemic. Clear communication promotes confidence in the employer's ability to protect workers and reduces absenteeism." And so one of the things that we need to do that might be a little different is think about what technology can we use that helps us, A, evaluate the risk, B, monitor the risk over time, and C, communicate that risk to our employees, contractors, people that are going into hazardous zones, risk areas, so that they have a better understanding of how to protect themselves. And I see in the poll results, it looks like most people are comfortable or very comfortable understanding and evaluating their technology options to help provide some of this information to workers. I think that's really part of the thing that's going to be most challenging. You know, I was in New Orleans as part of the Katrina effort, and there were people who just wouldn't go into certain neighborhoods, not because they were afraid of what they were going to find there, but because they didn't know how to protect themselves from what was already known to be there, because what was known wasn't being communicated. And so I think it really redefines how we think about communicating risk and taking care of our employees to make sure that they feel comfortable going into these risk zones, because it's going to be unavoidable. We have to be able to go in. There's a job that needs to be done, and you know, it's a way to protect people and communities, and that's the mission that has to be done. So that's what I would say.
Right.
Like,
And so you mentioned, oh, go ahead.
Yep. I was just going to say, find the tools that help you understand those three things that I talked about.
Okay. So Quentin, you mentioned Hurricane Katrina. Eric, I think this is a good time for us to talk about, are there any lessons that we can apply from past disasters such as Hurricane Katrina or Harvey to the COVID-19 pandemic? You know, and how have we as an industry embraced technology as we've looked to reduce face-to-face interactions?
Well, thanks, Lindsay, for the opportunity to participate. And yeah, there are some lessons that are clearly we have learned from some past disasters. You know, Hurricane Katrina was by far one of the more devastating ones that we had. I, like Quentin, spent a better part of 6 months down in New Orleans, kind of going through that. And it really was a different time, right? I mean, we think about that 15 years ago, you know, GPS was relatively new in terms of, you know, you were able to kind of put something on your car and kind of track yourself. But there were lots of streets that weren't, you know, kind of identified, and things like those had changed. In the current environment, right, we've become so much more in tune with technology, utilizing it and embracing it. It's wonderful. Alerts that can kind of come out there, and solutions like what Quentin's group at Earthvisionz has put out there does give you some very, very real-time opportunities to obtain that information. And then when you look at some of the other technologies out there, as far as work order management systems, even companies such as Altisource and other nationals, getting that information and then providing it up and down the chain is absolutely mission critical in order for us to be successful during this period of time. So again, one of the biggest differences, though, that I will speak to as it relates to previous, disasters, is that this is a real different one, right? I mean, for the first time ever, the United States has disaster declared declarations in all 50 states, as well as all of our territories. So something completely different. Previously, it's been something that's very much a local or a regional impact at best. We had the ability to kind of talk to other vendors in other areas and ask them if they might be able to not have to deal with the impact, and could they mobilize and kind of come into these areas. This one, you've got some lockdown situations, right? You have different mandates and directives at all different areas. What Ohio is doing, which is where I'm located, is different than what New York is doing, is different than what Colorado, Louisiana are doing. So again, there's a lot of change, and there's a lot of kind of that need for what you've heard a lot of is hyper local resources and understanding of what's going on. One of the big changes that I will say in the past from what we've gone through is that this is now coming more from a technology solution on high versus reliance on individuals in the field to be able to provide us with necessary information. So again, one of those things, we do still need to have that communication back and forth, but the key for us right now is really about understanding what directives and mandates are out there. And again, the technology that we have today is so much better than what we experienced during Hurricane Katrina, and even most recently Harvey, and some of the wildfires and other disasters that we've most recently experienced. One of the final challenges, that this is different than previous events is, in those events we talked about, hey, can you come in? Can you mobilize? Can you almost save the day mentality? And now there's a lot of hesitancy. I mean, across the board, whether it be at a national level, whether it be at a local level, even some of the servicers and some of the GSEs, there's a genuine concern. The great thing is we did see, early on when this pandemic, was announced and realized, HUD did put in an immediate stop all contact, right? As it relates to providing inspection related information, which was, again, put a lot of people at ease. And again, the association NAMFS has had conversations about that and was very upfront at the very beginning about trying to prevent those types of contacts from continuing, again, to try and put people more at ease. Next slide. Now, kind of what are we doing as an industry? There's been tons and tons of webinars, and this is a great example of one of those ones, trying to share the information, get it out. It's almost like information overload currently, right? MBA is having webinars. We've had webinars. Individual, 5 Star has done things. Lots of people trying to come together to apply a strategic solution. I do hearken back, and I don't want to, because it is different than Katrina, but one of the biggest things that happens is it's not just the initial question that we need to answer. It's the question beyond the question, that second and third level down. So again, yes, it's very simple. Hey, we've got to go ahead and do an inspection, or hey, we've got to go ahead and secure that property. But there are concerns that need to be addressed. Is it a safe environment? Are there lockdowns? What happens when I do run into a code enforcement or some type of, the legal aspect of it? Is it possible? We're also dealing with some things a little bit later we'll talk about, with our uniqueness of our industry. Quentin mentioned specifically employees and some guidance that was out there from OSHA. That's a little bit different, especially in a 1099 environment. We need to be very hypersensitive to that. The great thing is, like we've talked about, existing technology and solutions that are being developed in our space have allowed us to go ahead and create a contact inspection without contact. We all have, are familiar with FaceTime, Duo, things along those lines. But there are actually now, I can send out an invite via email, via text, something along those lines. The person can accept it. We access the smartphone, and then we can all see exactly what's going on. We can have forms created. There can be sign off. There can be pictures taken. Again, it's an amazing time compared to, for those of you who've been in the industry, when we talk about Polaroid pictures and sending in keys, those types of things. The technology has really advanced. And again, having those workflow systems has made everyone's life a little bit easier. But that also then requires a little bit of a higher touch service, which again, when there's pandemics, when there's billions and dollars worth of properties that are being addressed, clients are very, very sensitive and very concerned about what is the status of their property. Should they be taking action or should they not? So again, one of those things that we need to be really cognizant of is when we do run into these issues, when it is an identified area, that we're really communicating very, very well throughout the value chain. That includes requesting extensions, right? And that goes throughout the whole process. That might be the individual vendor doing the work. That might be the national provider up to their client. That may be the client or the servicer up to the investor insurer. So again, there is going to be a requirement for higher touch. People are going to be very, very concerned about what's going on. But again, we just need to kind of take that into consideration. Finally, as an industry, NAMFS has had a couple conversations as it relates to some types of cleaning solutions. There's lots of different types of products out there, not just necessarily, hey, I have to wipe it down, I have to touch it. There's fogging machines, there's biomedical, kind of electric charged, materials out there. And so again, we've had some conversations as it relates to manufacturers in that space, and then also bringing that forth to say, hey, is this some type of service that, there's an appetite for, there's an allowable for, as we kind of take these homes through a process? Is it a monthly service? Is it as part of a sales clean? Different types of solutions out there, because again, it is a very, very much a concern out there, walking into a situation where a home may be vacant and you're not really sure what the situation is. So those are some of the things that the industry is doing. So with that.
So what I'm hearing, the takeaway from that slide, Eric, is communicate, and then communicate some more. So communication is key right now throughout the pandemic across the value chain.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And again, like I said, trying to help vendors who may not be aware. as well, right? I mean, that communication is a two-way street. It's not just, hey, give me information. So that's absolutely key for sure. Did you want to do the poll question now?
Sure. So quick poll. Are there any areas of your business where your capabilities have changed or have been put under pressure? So you can select multiple options here.
And so, Lindsay, while this poll is going on, I just, some of the things that the association NAMFS has kind of noticed is, for our industry specifically, there are a lot of challenges that we've kind of gone through. And the first one I kind of mentioned early on was the model that we operate under, 1099 versus employees, right? If it's an employee, you can kind of control certain things. You can put into practice, things we use a lot of information related to the construction industry, landscaping industries, have people come in, let's take, temperatures, let's do those types of things. In our industry, it's a lot of, talking to 1099s, independent contractors who, may or may not have staff. So it is definitely a lot more challenging, in our industry. So looking at the poll question, obviously, the reduced volume is something that's certainly something that is probably a bit more, pandemic related, but it's something we've been kind of dealing with from, a continuing decline. Certainly the moratoriums on evictions and foreclosures will have an impact as it relates to preservation. On the converse side, requests for forbearance, HUD and the VA have clearly articulated that even a home in forbearance is subject to the need for an inspection. Fannie and Freddie, in their disaster forbearance guidance, indicate that if you've made contact with the borrower and the borrower is in the home, it's not necessarily required. So we're not sure exactly if that's going to continue or if there will be something like a periodic inspection that needs to be done. But it is something that we're kind of very aware of. There are challenges as it relates to reduced volume. But again, some of that is probably more conditional of the lower default rates. Some of the other complexities that we've noticed are, obtaining contact information in the age of enhanced NPPI. And then, in this current environment, right, not knowing who's coming to your house and not knowing, as Quentin indicated, 80 to 85% of people being asymptomatic, am I running into that problem? There is, we talked a little bit earlier, technology solutions, but again, there's some additional costs, and that's something that the industry is trying to understand and figure out if those costs can be included into some of those types of solutions into the allowables that are out there. Some other concerns that we see are access and cost of proper PPE, personal protective equipment. In the NAMFS Academy, we do have a section that talks a lot about, what is the appropriate level of personal property equipment. And I know a lot of people who are in the industry, oh, that's not really necessary. That's not really necessary. In today's day and age, I mean, clearly, as Quentin indicated earlier, the need to make people feel at ease and feel comfortable. Those are things that are going to be required and expected. So again, access and cost to proper PPE is huge. My sister is actually in the healthcare field. She works at a nursing home, and she said that she's seen, what was her normal paper Tyvek suits, go from about $35 for 50 of them, upwards of $500. So these costs really need to be articulated and again, communicated so that we can kind of understand what needs to be done. Finally, one of the other concerns and complexities is the timeframes related to completing services. Inspections, it was fairly simple. We took away the contact requirement along those lines, which has helped, but certainly for lost draft inspections, that's an area of major concern. You have a person coming into your home whom you don't know, but at the same point, you're trying to get resources to do your repairs. So those are very, very, concerning. But for preservation, it's a little bit more difficult. You have social distancing requirements, spreading out the work, not having multiple people, not communicating, you're not congregating, those types of things. Bringing neighbors to have concern because there's a large group of people at a property, what's going on there. So again, can we spread the work out versus doing it all at once? We are, like I said, looking at things like construction, and now that you've got these states starting to open up and construction is coming back in a lot of those areas first. We're using those as key drivers for direction and for ideas. And then there's the network challenges, which were identified as well on there. Remoteness is one, but sickness, there are concerns. We're going out to properties, and lots of people are concerned about that for their own health, for what they can bring home to their families. You have obviously different people with different health levels. So those are things that we've all kind of identified and we're working on trying to improve. So some current resources, much like Quentin had said, we do have some. We have published a couple webinars related to Earthvisionz solution, and then one experience, which is that virtual inspection that I spoke of earlier. The NAMFS Academy courses that we have, we do talk about those as far as what would be required, especially as it relates to property preservation. And then on our website, we also have our servicing guidelines, that are out there, in addition to, the Academy courses. And then we have a specific COVID-19 page that's out there that also provides a link to a useful weather version of Earthvisionz V-Alert. So those are some resources that are out there that we'd like to share.
Great, so I can just Google NAMFS and all of these resources will be at my fingertips?
Sure, yep. NAMFS.org, NAMFS.org is the website. And again, those resources are available. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out through the contact that I'm sure will be shared as part of this.
Great. Thank you, Eric. So RJ, I think this is a good time for us to transition the conversation to what you're hearing and seeing from the field. And specifically, are there any best practices that you can share?
Absolutely. So like what everyone else said, especially Eric made some great points about the 1099 versus employees, is the first thing that we've tried to communicate is that we want all of our vendors to be safe and healthy. We absolutely appreciate, and I want to recognize that I think there's probably a lot of vendors on the line listening right now, everything that our essential workers are doing for us. So I really applaud everybody for going out there, making these communities safe, and thank them for their hard work during this time. Our communication has been very consistent along the lines of everything else you've heard. Is number one, they need to listen to local and regional governments and ensure that They're making the right decisions, listening to their local regulations, listening to World Health Organization and CDC recommendations, and doing what's best for them. And then they need to communicate with us. And then we need to talk about how to deal with the hyperlocalization. And I think those are really the three key components of dealing with this situation, which has been slightly different than all of the previous other disasters that we've dealt with. So specifically, if you go to my first slide, health first is the thing that you can find this one, CDC, World Health Organization, a few other places. I think NAMFS, like you said, has a sheet on this. But really, when we're looking at the first and foremost barrier, it's that social distancing that we keep hearing about, is trying to avoid the close contact and the large groups aggregated at homes. Anything that we can do to keep a large group of people drawing attention, spreading the virus, being around people that may be very sensitive or giving a perception that they're doing something against those recommendations, we're advising, hey, you may not want to do that, right? Try to do the work like Eric mentioned, where you're spreading this work out, where you have limited people being able to do the work versus having large groups of people walking into a house or hanging around the front entry of a house outside, those types of things. Using delivery and pickup for materials versus we've witnessed a long transition or a long timeline for people who have to go to stores and then wait in the long lines to get in the stores to get their materials, which further extends their timeline and really puts them in a position where they're around more people because they're walking in a store full of people. And I know my personal experience walking in stores is most of the people walking in stores are not adhering to any type of guidelines. They're walking without face masks, all those kind of things. And then lastly, in terms of the social distancing, it's being very careful with those interior work on occupied property, things like those virtual loss draft inspections that we talked about, and trying to get them to more of a virtual program that works with our clients' needs. You know, it has to be at the comfort level of the inspector, the homeowner, the worker, the homeowner, that the social distancing should be maintained. And if at all possible, we try to do it virtually. The second category would be ensuring that when you're in the field, to Eric's point, the recommendation is wear the PPE. You know, the CDC and World Health Organization are putting those recommendations out there for a reason. The gloves, the face coverings, et cetera, are very important in stopping the spread of this virus. Next, I would say be respectful. I think it's been mentioned already, is that this is about the perception of people you're around. And so if you're walking around, you're making a lot of noise, congregating at the front of a home, you're not wearing any CDC, PPE recommendations, those types of things, there's a perception there. When you're coughing to your elbow, if you're showing symptoms, stay home. Like everybody has to eat, but this is not a normal sickness. So going to work when you're sick is really not advisable. And one of the other things that we've witnessed is that like blower usage in certain parts of the country draws attention, and which led to code officers going when they hear the blower or a neighbor saying, hey, you're blowing the virus all around. So those types of things, we've said, hey, let's limit being on the front of a property and using a blower as much as we can versus doing it maybe the old fashioned way with a broom and a dustpan or a rake. Again, cleaning your hands, using sanitizer, cleaning after yourself, disinfecting, especially the high risk areas. And the CDC, World Health Organization, NAMFS, many other places that you could find online are all great resources to get more details on this. And you can go to the next page. Now, in terms of communication, that's really where this whole thing boils down to. And I know you've already, Eric has talked about the importance of communication. If I was already very pro communication before, it's magnified tenfold now. So we've at Altisource incorporated many different ways that we're trying to reach out and contact our vendors. I'd say I'm on the phone with vendors probably 3 or 4 hours a day right now myself. My team is making more of an effort. We've built email campaigns where we're sharing the guidelines and recommendations. We've given an authorization letter where we're stating our claim as an essential service to have, and I'll explain a little bit more, but I believe NAMFS has actually done something similar, and that has been used and hasn't been used in certain cases, and we can talk more about that on the next slide. We have an ongoing outbound call campaign and a weekly survey to all of our vendors asking them, what are you seeing out in the field? Are you running into any problems, so that we could have a very clear communication chain and a communication line open with our vendors. We've also created a coronavirus specific email inbox that we monitor with several people throughout different business lines of business at Altisource. For any concerns that they have, email us, where we've got people monitoring it and can specifically try to react and give clear direction. And then the most important thing that I believe we've done that's been very helpful is on all of our work orders created a category in the work order called COVID-19, so that for any vendor who runs into a challenge on a work order due to coronavirus or related to the coronavirus in any way, can tag it there so that we have reporting and categorization of the things that they're seeing, so that we could take those back to our clients and say, hey, this is what we're running into, this is what we're seeing, how can we deal with this on a one-off basis, or create a rule around it so that we could be more effective in the field. You can go to the next page. All right, I think actually we have a poll question while I go through this page. Lindsay, do you want to read off that poll?
Yes. So what has been the biggest challenge you've experienced when trying to complete services in the field?
So this is an interesting one for me. I'd love to see what the responses are. The biggest challenge I've seen is actually the next slide that we'll go over here, is that hyper-localization of enforcement. What I am hearing and seeing is that really all of the regulations have been enforced by whoever is reading and their interpretation of the regulations being passed, and it's not holistic, right? So earlier we talked about like neighborhood level or home level or state level regulations, how they're so different. But really where it gets even more challenging is that it could be the specific code officer or the specific cop or firefighter or neighbor who interprets those regulations a slightly different way and wants to escalate, fine, or stop somebody from working. And so when we run into these things, we ask our vendors just to stop, be respectful, communicate with us so that we could figure out what we should do. Let's see. All right, fines or tickets, neighbors, health concerns. All right, that's good. We actually, in terms of the health concerns, I would agree, but we've actually heard a lot less of the health concerns from our vendors and a lot more of the concerns with neighbors, and fines and tickets is what we hear locally. So that's very interesting response. Let's see, do the right thing. We really want to focus our vendors on doing the right thing. Ultimately, as a company and this industry, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to serve the communities of these abandoned and foreclosed properties, right? We want to reduce blight and all those things. We don't want to go into an area where we create more havoc than we're solving for. So if you run into somebody that has an issue of what you're doing, like I said, is do the right thing, communicate, make sure you keep your social distancing, make sure you're wearing your PP, and then you're communicating back with us, and then let us deal with the situation to say, hey, let's extend the order or let's change how to finish this order. We have heard in some instances, which is really interesting with the hyperlocalization, that we have certain like Home Depots and Lowe's or other material stores where they may deem certain materials essential or non-essential, and actually like they have their stores open, but then rope off certain sections of materials in a store where they say, hey, you can't buy paint, for instance. This is non-essential, but you can go buy a hammer and this is essential. And so again, in Louisiana, Home Depot and Lowe's is like a wide open, like there's all kind of people in it and no line and people are buying whatever they want. And then you go to a different county in New York and very difficult to get certain materials. And then the last piece that we've really recognized that we've been trying to work around is dumps, where they've said, hey, you have to be a licensed hauler in order to dump here. And so for a lot of our vendors who pick up their trash in a trailer, but are not a dumpster company or a licensed garbage disposal company, they're having difficulty finding a place to dump the material or having to drive further to dump the material. And so debris removal and dumping of material is always a highlighted issue within our industry because we want to make sure it's dealt with properly. But it even gets more highlighted when the way to deal with it properly is shut off to some of our people. And so this is something that, again, is on a dump by dump basis that we face these things. And it's very difficult, and we just have to work with our clients to make sure that we're clearly communicating. And then lastly, I would just say, communication, like Eric said, is the key, is that when you run into these things, talk to us, let's figure out the solution together. Don't put yourself in a position where you're gonna get fined or create a media escalation or anything like that. We wanna make sure that we're doing right by the people that we're serving and the communities we're serving. Lindsay?
Great. Okay. Well, Michael, I think it's time to take Q&A from the audience.
Excellent, Lindsay. Thank you for that. So this first question, this is for you, RJ. From your experience, have you heard if the essential authorization letter has been successful?
Yes. So through our surveys and our communications, we've received about 10 times that our vendors ran into an authority where they had to present the letter, and 9 out of the 10 were successful, and 1 out of the 10 was someone who said, I don't care about that letter, leave. And so again, I think that this is one of those instances and cases where we could do all the right things and feel like potentially somebody's meeting the letter of the law, but it's still the person that's there interpreting that law and how he perceives whether or not that letter is worth any value or not. And so this is where you just have to say, okay, thank you, be respectful, and then communicate back to us. And I think NAMFS also did something similar. So Eric, I think you worked on an authorization letter too, which has been helpful in the industry. You want to speak about that a little bit?
Sure, RJ, thanks. Yeah, NAMFS was initially, again, kind of reaching out. New York was among the first and the most kind of stringent out there with their kind of guidance. And so, NAMFS had conversations with several other entities. And then, we talked about trying to do something with, some origination individuals as well. And then ultimately submitted a letter on behalf of it ended up being from NAMFS explaining what position we took. And then, based upon the guidance that was out there, that deemed the services in our industry as essential to speak to that. So that's kind of what we did. Again, when we sent that off to the state of New York, we did not receive any kind of, denial of service along those lines. And so that was kind of our guidance. And again, within our guidance as well, though, we did articulate that as independent contractors, it's ultimately up to each individual business owner or service provider to take a look at their industry, at their business, at their situation, and then articulate it back if it didn't make sense, or if for some reason they saw it as a huge detriment, or they were unable to provide the services.
Excellent, excellent. Eric, RJ, appreciate that. Here's our next question from Jane. How do we maintain situational awareness in an environment of persistent risk with an inability to confirm exposure? Quentin, I want to go ahead and toss that one over to you.
Thanks. I think first, worth exploring what we mean when we talk about situational awareness. Really, I'd probably spin that in the case of a pandemic to be risk awareness. And so using tools that allow us to have a visualization of what the risk is around where I am and where the people and things I care about are located, and using that as an enabler to make some of the decisions that Eric and RJ have talked about with regard to ways to mitigate risk. So situational awareness, I think I mentioned earlier that when you go into an environment where you can't confirm risk, you have to assume it. You have to assume exposure is a given and do what you can to mitigate the risk down to the lowest level possible, knowing that, especially without understanding more deeply, you're not going to be able to eliminate it. So you mitigate it as much as you can based on what you understand. I think in times like this, there is a natural impulse to try and collect as much data as you can on your own, which is worthy. And we want to be able to make better decisions in real time when we're operating in crisis and risk environments. But there's also, even we think about things from a national security perspective, we have coalition partners that we share information with in the context of what we're talking about today, democratization of information, sharing and collaborating in risk areas so that we have a more persistent understanding of risk, and that it's not, especially if I'm a contractor and I work on contract for one service provider, I have a better understanding of risk than I do when I work on contract for another service provider. I don't look at that in this case as a competitive advantage per se. I look at that as just a basic human necessity. So sharing information in a way that's different and using tools that pull that together for you. Also, we're facing environments of that necessitate cost control, cost reduction, cost elimination, cost avoidance, and sharing information, or using tools that pull information together and provide it to many instead of one at a time paying for the same data will go a long way. So I would say share data, or if you can't do that directly yourself and you want to manage the cost more effectively, then use a tool that pulls the data together and makes it accessible to many people so that you can do the mitigation that Eric and RJ have described. And thanks for the question. It's a good question.
Awesome. Yeah, great. Thank you for that, Quentin. And so we do have time, so I want to go ahead and pose this next question. And I'd actually like to give RJ, Quentin, and Eric the opportunity to answer this question. So RJ, we'll start with you for this question, then go to Quentin and Eric. So here's the question. What do you think the short and long-term effects will be of COVID-19? Yep.
Wow.
That's a softball, right?
That's a hard one. I think that the answer is we don't know. I could very easily play out multiple scenarios where, in terms of our industry, we see a lot more volume. And I could play the same scenarios where it slows down, and what the timing is on that has so many dependencies. Every day I feel like there's a new news story or a new direction that we're going with delinquency and how we're going to treat forbearance, which ultimately for us has a huge impact on what we'll do and what we won't do. And I think each servicer is also feeling their way out of what are the right things to do in terms of forbearance versus not do, whether they're going to inspect these homes, whether they're not going to inspect these homes. And each time a decision is made, it has an influence on the volume that we could potentially see. And so I would love to say, this is what I'm projecting, but that the true answer for me is we don't know. And I think it's still very early in the game to predict. But Eric and Quentin, if you guys see something else, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think the unknown nature of things is accurate. I think there's a tendency to want to believe that things are going to go back to, quote, normal the way it used to be. But the reality is we don't really know what that means. And I think that one of the things that changes, now and forward, at least for the near foreseeable future, is that the risk profile is different than it is when we talk about a natural disaster or man-made situation like wildfires, meaning that the triggering event in that kind of a situation, as part of my first crisis response was 1989 in the Loma Prieta earthquake in the San Francisco Bay Area. We went in after the event was over. This event isn't over. And so the risk profile is different because now we're operating in an environment where the event is ongoing. And I think that's going to require us to really shift the way that we think about things. We're not responding to an event that's, quote, over. We're maneuvering in an environment where it's ongoing.
Yeah. I could just, if you don't mind, Eric, I could jump back in. And I was just thinking of something as you were saying that is, so I live in New Orleans, and post-Katrina, we were asking the same questions. And even 6 months after Katrina, when we were asked those questions, we were so far off from how long it actually took and the things that we would see in terms of the industry in New Orleans and what to expect. And so that was a more defined, where it was probably more predictable event than this. And it was still so much different in the things that we ran into 2-3 years down the road. And so I would just say, very, very difficult. And any guess, I think right now would be pretty unfounded.
Well said.
Awesome.
Yeah, well, yeah, I was just say, so
Yep.
RJ and Quentin, I tend to agree, right? I mean, short term, there's some immediates, right? I mean, obviously we see forbearance going up, which theoretically, right, should lead to additional inspections. To your point, RJ, that's individual, servicers, and all that stuff that make those decisions. I think the longer term impact is really going to be not only determined by the pandemic, but ultimately what happens because of the pandemic, right? I mean, the unknowns around people returning to work. I saw again today where another 3.1 or 3.2 million people filed for unemployment. If things do come back, and to Quinn's point about normal or new normal or however you want to say that, I mean, are people going to, just because restaurants open up, are people going to go back and fill them again? And if they don't fill them again, does that mean that that particular entity, comes back, or does it hire less staff? The interconnectedness of our world, and the industry, it's not just a simple, oh, well, we make cars, right? It's, well, we do this. Well, that impacts this industry. It impacts that industry. And so I think to your guys' point, no one really knows exactly how long this will go on. And again, the longer term effects, we don't know. It's not simple. Like I said, it's not that here's the initial question, bang. It's 3 and 4 levels deep. So, again, we're so early in it, we don't know yet.
Great. Well, thank you guys. So we are out of time. I want to thank the audience and the panelists for participating. Most importantly, thank you to the essential workers out in the field, preserving and protecting our properties, keeping our community safe. We appreciate you. So thank you, and I hope everyone has a good rest of their day. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.